There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Ulrich Wehner. I held the rank of brother captain in the Iron Hammers chapter, and once I believed in glory. Once I thought that to die in battle was the greatest honour a space marine could know. I was wrong. To live in battle forever is a curse that no prayer can lift and no faith can make bearable. They tell me I have been asleep for 73 years. When I speak of sleep, I mean something you cannot understand. It is not the rest of mortals where dreams carry you to distant shores, or memories warm you like a hearth fire. It is the sleep of the dead who cannot die, a void so complete that when consciousness returns, I wonder if I ever existed at all. In those moments of waking, I search for my body and find only steel. I reach for my hands and discover weapons. I try to breathe and hear only the mechanical wheeze of life support systems that keep my ruined flesh alive within this tomb they call salvation. The first time I awoke in this sarcophagus, I thought it was a dream born of fever. The battle on Marak Prime had gone poorly. I remembered the Orcish horde breaking through our defensive line, their crude axes and hammers falling like rain upon ceramite armour. I remembered the weight of the power fist as it crushed the skull of their warlord, and I remembered the sensation of my own spine snapping like a dry branch when the beast's dying blow found the gap between my backpack and gorget. Death should have followed swiftly. Death would have been a mercy. Instead, I found myself looking through optical sensors at the face of Chaplain Marai. His skull-faced helm leaned close to my sarcophagus, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ceremony. "Brother Captain Wehner," he said, "you have been chosen for the highest honour. Your service to the Emperor continues." I tried to speak and heard the grinding mechanical voice that now serves as my own. "What have you done to me?" "We have saved you," I replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he knew the cruelty of his words. "Your body was broken beyond the arts of our apothecaries, but your spirit burns too bright to be lost. You are reborn in iron and adamantium. You are Dreadnought." The word fell upon me like a headsman's axe. I had seen Dreadnoughts in battle, those towering engines of war that strode through enemy ranks like walking fortresses. I had revered them as I revered the dead heroes whose names were carved in our chapter's halls of remembrance. Now I understood why they moved with such terrible purpose, why their voices carried the weight of epochs. They were not machines of war, they were prisons for the living dead. "How long?" I asked. "The surgery was completed 3 days ago. Your systems are functioning within acceptable parameters." 3 days. I had been unconscious for 3 days, but it felt like centuries. Already, I could sense the gulf opening beneath me, that vast emptiness that would swallow years of my existence. "When will I sleep again?" Marai's silence stretched longer than it should have. "When the chapter has no more need of your service." He did not say never, but I heard it in the hollow spaces between his words. The first battle came within a week. Orc raiders had struck at Nagraworld in the Hadrian system, and the Iron Hammers were dispatched to cleanse them. I was loaded into the drop pod alongside my battle brothers, the familiar ritual of preparation made strange by my new form. Where once I had checked my bolt pistol and chainsword, now I tested the targeting systems of my assault cannon and the articulation of my power fist. Where once I had whispered prayers for victory and honour, now I simply existed, a consciousness trapped within a shell of metal and ceramite. The drop was violent, as all drops were, but I felt none of the adrenaline that once made my twin hearts race with anticipation. The crash of impact, the hiss of opening seals, the first breath of alien air, all these sensations were filtered through mechanical sensors and fed to my brain as data rather than experience. I missed the weight of a bolter in my hands, I missed the feeling of my boots striking solid ground, but when battle was joined, I began to understand why I had been preserved. My assault cannon spoke with the voice of the Emperor's wrath, its shells tearing through orcish flesh like paper. My power fist crushed skulls and rent armour with an ease that my mortal form had never possessed. I was death incarnate, an angel of annihilation wrapped in blessed steel. For those brief hours of combat I felt something approaching purpose. The orcs fell before me like wheat before the scythe. Their crude weapons sparked harmlessly against my armour, and their loudest war cries were drowned by the thunder of my guns. I advanced through their lines with inexorable purpose, crushing everything that dared stand against me. In those moments, I was everything a Space Marine was meant to be. I was the Emperor's vengeance made manifest. But battles end. Victory was achieved, the Xenos threat eliminated, and the world returned to the embrace of the Imperium. My battle brothers boarded the transport back to our strike cruiser, their voices raised in songs of triumph. I was loaded into a separate compartment, secured against movement, my systems gradually cycling down to standby mode. "Sleep well, Ancient One," said Brother Thaddeus, one of the younger Marines who had fought beside me. He meant it kindly, I think. He could not know that sleep was not rest for me, but a kind of death. As my consciousness faded, I wondered when I would wake again, and what I would wake to find. The second awakening came sooner than I expected. Only months had passed, though they felt like years in the remembering. The chapter was under attack. A Chaos warband had emerged from the warp near our homeworld of Korath, bringing with them the stench of corruption and the promise of damnation. All available forces were mobilized for the defense, and that included me. This battle was different from the last. Where the Orcs had been savage but predictable, these Chaos Marines fought with a cunning that mirrored our own. They knew our tactics because they had once used them. They anticipated our strategies because they had once planned them. Worse still, they knew our weaknesses for they had once shared them. I found myself locked in combat with a Chaos Dreadnought, a thing of rusted iron and screaming demonic faces. Its pilot had once been a Space Marine like myself, but corruption had twisted him into something monstrous. As our weapons clashed and our armour sparked, I heard his voice crackling through vox speakers corroded by centuries of malice. "Do you see what you have become, loyalist?" he hissed. "A ghost in a shell, a soul in chains. You think you serve the Emperor, but you serve only the machine that has devoured you." I crushed his head with my power fist, silencing his blasphemous words, but they echoed in my mind long after his form had ceased its thrashing. Was this what I was becoming? A thing more machine than man, held together by duty and desperation? I pushed the thought aside and continued the battle, but seeds of doubt had been planted in soil too fertile for such dark growth. The Chaos forces were eventually driven back into the warp from whence they came, but not before they had inflicted grievous casualties upon our chapter. Many of my battle brothers lay dead, their gene seed harvested by the apothecaries for future generations. I attended their funeral rites, standing silent vigil over their pyres as flames reduced flesh and bone to ash and memory. Chapter Master Corvin delivered the eulogy, his words carrying the weight of centuries. "These brothers have found peace in the Emperor's embrace," he said. "Their watches ended, their duty complete. They rest now in halls of honour, where pain cannot touch them and sorrow holds no dominion." I envied them. I envied their peace, their completion, their rest. They had died as heroes, their names to be remembered, and their deeds to be celebrated. I would live on, trapped in this shell of metal and ceramite, witness to the slow decay of all I had once held dear. After the funeral, I was returned to the depths of the fortress monastery, to the sacred halls where dreadnoughts waited between battles. The chamber was vast and echoing, filled with dozens of sarcophagi in various states of activation. Some hummed with the quiet power of functioning life support, their occupants lost in whatever passed for dreams among the entombed. Others sat cold and silent, their ancient inhabitants finally granted the rest that had been so long denied them. Brother Ancient Gareth occupied the sarcophagus next to mine. He had been interred for over 4 centuries, and his wisdom was sought by chapter leadership when particularly difficult decisions needed to be made. As my system cycled down, I heard his voice crackling through the Vox network that connected all dreadnoughts in the chamber. "First battles are always the hardest, young brother," he said, his mechanical voice carrying undertones of something that might once have been warmth. "You still remember what it was like to be flesh and blood. That memory is both blessing and curse." "How do you bear it?" I asked. "The isolation, the endless waiting." "By forgetting," Gareth replied. "Each time you wake you will remember a little less of what you were before. The human memories fade like morning mist, leaving only the warrior's purpose. It is the kindness the machine spirit grants to those who serve it faithfully." His words should have been comforting, but they filled me with dread instead. To forget what I had been was to lose what little remained of Ulrich Venar. Would I eventually become nothing more than a weapon with a soul, a gun that could think but no longer dream? The prospect terrified me more than any enemy I had ever faced. Sleep claimed me again, and this time it lasted longer. When I next awoke, frost covered my sarcophagus, and the taste of stale, recycled air filled my olfactory senses. The chamber was darker than I remembered, many of the other dreadnoughts now cold and silent. I tried to contact Gareth through the Vox network, but his frequency returned only static. "Brother Ancient Gareth is at rest," said a voice I did not recognise. One of the other dreadnoughts had spoken, his sarcophagus bearing honours I did not remember seeing before. His vigil ended 37 years ago. I am Brother Ancient Matthias. Welcome back to the living, Brother Ulrich. 37 years. I had slept for 37 years, and in that time Gareth had finally been granted the peace of true death. Part of me rejoiced for him, but a larger part felt the cold fingers of fear closing around what remained of my heart. How many more of my brothers had died while I slumbered? How much of the world I had known had changed beyond recognition? "What have I missed?" I asked. "Much and little," Matthias replied. "Wars have been fought and won. The chapter has recruited new brothers to replace the fallen. The Imperium endures, as it always has and always shall. But the details, the faces, the names, these fade with time. Only the eternal verities remain." I was awakened for another battle, though I no longer remembered the enemy we faced or the world we fought upon. The campaigns blurred together in my memory like watercolours in rain. Orcs, Chaos Marines, Eldar Raiders, renegade Imperial forces. It no longer mattered. I had become what I was created to be, a weapon in the Emperor's arsenal, pointed at whatever target required destruction. But with each awakening, I noticed changes. The faces of my battle brothers grew younger and less familiar. The rituals of preparation evolved in subtle ways that spoke of decades passing like days. The very architecture of our ships and fortresses showed signs of modification and improvement, the work of generations of tech marines who had never known me as anything but an ancient one to be revered from a distance. Most disturbing of all were the changes in myself. I found it increasingly difficult to recall specific memories from my time as a flesh-and-blood space marine. The faces of my old squad brothers grew hazy and indistinct. The sound of my original voice became a whisper in my mind, overwhelmed by the mechanical tones that now served as my speech. Even my name began to feel strange and foreign, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. During one awakening, I attempted to access the chapter's archives to research my own history. The records were there, faithfully maintained by the librarians, but reading about Brother Captain Ulrich Vaynar felt like studying the life of a stranger. Here was a man who had led charges across the battlefields of a dozen worlds. Here was a warrior who had earned the respect of his peers and the fear of his enemies. Here was a hero whose deeds had been deemed worthy of preservation in living iron. But I could not feel the connection between that man and what I had become. The memories were there, locked away in the organic portions of my brain, but they seemed to belong to someone else. It was as if Ulrich Vaynar had died on Morak Prime, and something else had awakened in his place, wearing his name like an ill-fitting garment. It was during the siege of Vaelthera that I first began to truly understand the horror of what I had become. The planet was a shrine world, its surface covered with vast cathedrals and holy monuments that stretched toward heaven like stone prayers. The enemy was a chaos cult that had wormed its way into the very heart of the planetary government, corrupting the faithful from within until their prayers became blasphemies and their devotion became damnation. I had been awakened for this campaign because my tactical database contained extensive information about urban warfare and siege operations. The tech priests who performed my activation seemed particularly excited by the prospect of deploying me against heretics rather than Xenos, as if the purity of my purpose somehow made their work more sacred. But as I was loaded into the drop pod alongside a squad of tactical marines, I found myself studying their faces through my optical sensors. They were young, even by Astartes' standards, their armour bearing the gleaming perfection of recent forging. One of them, a sergeant whose nameplate read Corin, bore a striking resemblance to someone from my past, though I could not place the memory with any certainty. "This is an honour, Ancient One," Sergeant Corin said as the drop pod prepared for launch. "My grandfather spoke of fighting beside you during the Morton campaign." The Morton campaign. I searched my memory banks for references to that conflict, and found detailed tactical, reports and casualty assessments, but no emotional context. There had been orcs, I remembered, and a long siege of a hive city, but the human elements of the story had been lost to time and the gradual erosion of my organic memory. "Your grandfather was a fine warrior," I said, though I could not recall his face or his voice or the manner of his death. "He died with honour." "He lived with honour too," Corin replied. "He often said that watching you fight was like watching the Emperor's own wrath made manifest. More empty words, more meaningless praise. I had heard such things countless times over the centuries, and they no longer moved me. I was what I was, a weapon wrapped in the legend of a man who had died long ago." The young Marines around me saw glory where I felt only the mechanical compulsion to fulfill my programming. The drop to Vaelthara's surface was rough, atmospheric storms lashing our pod as it screamed through the clouded sky. When we impacted, the crash was so violent that one of the tactical Marines was thrown against his restraints, hard enough to crack his helmet. I felt nothing, my massive form too well secured and too heavily armoured to be affected by such minor turbulence. The city we deployed into was a monument to faith corrupted. Where once there had been soaring spires dedicated to the Emperor's glory, now twisted symbols of the dark gods scarred the stonework. The air itself felt thick with malice, heavy with the weight of prayers offered to entities that should never have been named. Even my mechanical senses could detect the wrongness that permeated this place. But as we advanced through streets that had once echoed with hymns of devotion, I realized that I felt no anger at the desecration I witnessed. The sight of defiled altars and mutilated statues should have filled me with righteous fury, should have driven me to acts of terrible vengeance against those responsible. Instead, I simply catalogued the tactical implications of each bit of destruction, noting how the heretics had converted sacred spaces into defensive positions. We encountered our first resistance at the Cathedral of St. Marga, where cultists had barricaded themselves behind overturned pews and makeshift defences. They opened fire as we approached, their lass rifles sparking against our armour like angry stars. I responded with my assault cannon, the heavy shells reducing their cover to splinters and their bodies to component elements. "Advance," I commanded, and the tactical Marines moved forward with practised precision. They cleared the cathedral room by room, their bolters speaking death to any who dared stand against the Emperor's will. But as I watched them work, I found myself calculating acceptable casualty rates rather than feeling concern for their welfare. Sergeant Corin took a last round to the shoulder that penetrated the weak point where his pauldron met his breastplate. The wound was not serious by Astarte's standards, but it bled freely and clearly caused him pain. In my former life, I would have felt something at the sight of a brother's injury, some flicker of concern or anger at the enemy who had caused it. Now I simply noted the reduction in his combat effectiveness and adjusted my tactical assessments accordingly. "Are you able to continue, Sergeant?" I asked. "I am, Ancient One," he replied, sealing the breach in his armour with emergency foam. "It would take more than heretic scum to stop a son of Kor. Sons of Kor." The phrase stirred something in the deepest recesses of my memory, some echo of pride or belonging that had somehow survived the centuries of mechanical existence. But it was faint, like the memory of a dream, and it faded even as I tried to grasp it. The campaign on Vaelthara lasted for months. We fought through corrupted cities and desecrated shrines, our boots treading ground that had been sanctified by the prayers of countless pilgrims over the millennia. With each battle, each victory, we pushed the heretics back toward their final stronghold in the planet's primary cathedral spire. But as the war progressed, I began to notice changes in the Marines fighting alongside me. The constant exposure to chaos corruption, the daily witness to blasphemy and desecration, was taking its toll on their spirits. They began to perform additional rituals of purification after each engagement, spending hours in prayer and meditation to cleanse themselves of whatever taint they might have absorbed. I felt none of this spiritual burden. The symbols of chaos that drove my brothers to fury or despair registered to me only as target markers, locations to be cleansed with fire and shell. The blasphemous chants that made veteran Marines clamp their hands over their ears were simply noise to me, audio input to be filtered and ignored. I had become immune to corruption, not through faith or purity, but through the simple fact that I no longer possessed enough humanity to be tempted. This realization struck me during the final assault on the cathedral spire as we breached the inner sanctum where the cult's leadership had made their last stand. The chamber was a perversion of everything sacred, its walls covered with sigils that seemed to writhe and pulse in the flickering light. At the centre stood a figure that had once been human, now transformed into something that hurt to look upon, even through my mechanical senses. The thing that had once been the planetary governor spoke in a voice like grinding metal and breaking glass. "Welcome, servants of the false emperor. Come, witness the truth that lies beyond the veil of your precious imperium. See what your devotion has earned you." Sergeant Corrin raised his bolter, but his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely maintain his grip. The other Marines were in similar states, their faith warring with the evidence of corruption that surrounded them. Only I remained, unaffected, my targeting systems calmly acquiring the abomination that mocked them with its existence. "I see nothing but another target to be eliminated," I replied, and opened fire. My assault cannon spoke its familiar thunder, heavy shells tearing through the creature's transformed flesh with mechanical precision. It died as all things died when faced with sufficient firepower, its blasphemous existence ended by the simple application of violence. The Marines around me cheered, their faith restored by the sight of evil's defeat, but I felt nothing at all. The campaign ended with the planet's purification, its temples reconsecrated, and its population subjected to the mercies of the Inquisition. Those found pure were allowed to live, while those tainted by corruption were granted the Emperor's peace through bolt and flame. It was just another victory in an endless war, just another world saved from the darkness that pressed in on all sides. But as I was loaded into the transport that would carry me back to my tomb, Sergeant Corrin approached my sarcophagus with something approaching reverence in his posture. He removed his helmet, revealing a face that was indeed similar to someone I had once known, though I could no longer place the memory with any certainty. "Ancient One," he said, "I wanted to thank you for your service during this campaign. Your presence gave us strength when we might have faltered." I looked down at him through my optical senses, this young warrior who had fought bravely beside me through months of horror and corruption. He was everything a Space Marine should be, brave and dedicated and filled with faith in the righteousness of his cause. He would probably die in some future battle, his name added to the rolls of honour that no one would remember reading. "You fought well, Corrin," I said. "Your chapter is fortunate to have you." He smiled at that, an expression of simple pride that should have warmed whatever remained of my heart. Instead, I found myself calculating how long it would be before that smile was lost forever, before time and war ground him down into just another entry in the casualty reports. "Will you remember this campaign, Ancient One?" he asked. "Will you remember us?" The question struck me with unexpected force. Would I remember? Already the details were beginning to fade, subsumed into the vast database of tactical information that constituted most of my memory. The faces of the Marines, the specific battles we had fought, the words we had exchanged. All of it would eventually be reduced to dry statistical data unless I made a conscious effort to preserve it. "I will remember," I lied, because the truth would have been too cruel to speak. But even as I said it, I knew it was false. I would sleep, and when I woke, Corrin would be just another name in the archives, another ghost from campaigns that blurred together into an endless parade of violence and death. The organic portions of my brain that might have retained the emotional context of our interactions were failing bit by bit, year by year, leaving only the mechanical aspects of memory behind. Sleep claimed me once again, and this time the dreams were different. Instead of the usual void of unconsciousness, I found myself walking through corridors that seemed familiar yet strange. The walls were decorated with battle honours I recognised, but the names beneath them belonged to Marines I had never heard of. When I tried to read the inscriptions more closely, the words seemed to shift and blur, as if my very attention was enough to make them fade away. I walked until I came to a chamber I knew I should recognise, though I could not place it in any specific memory. Standing in the centre was a figure in power armour, his back turned to me as he studied a tactical display. When he turned around, I saw my own face looking back at me, but it was a face I had not worn for centuries. "Hello, Ulrich," he said, and his voice was the voice I remembered having before the machines replaced my larynx with Vox speakers. "Who are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I am who you were," he replied. "I am the man who died on Marak Prime, the warrior they claimed to have saved. I am everything they cut away when they sealed you in that tomb." I tried to speak, but found that my voice had become the mechanical rasp I was used to. harsh and artificial in this place of memories and dreams. "Why are you here?" "To remind you," he said, "to show you what they took when they gave you this eternal half-life. Look around you, Ulrich. Look at what you have become." I looked, and for the first time in centuries I saw myself as others saw me. I was a massive thing of metal and ceramite, a walking weapon that bore only the faintest resemblance to anything that had ever been human. My limbs were gun barrels and weapon mounts, my torso an armoured shell designed to protect the small remnant of flesh that still contained what was left of my consciousness. I was not a man wearing armour, but a machine that happened to contain the ghost of a man's memories. "They told me I was honoured," I said. "They told you many things," the figure replied. "They said your service would continue, that your wisdom would guide future generations, that your sacrifice would not be forgotten. But what did they not tell you?" I thought about that question for a long time, reviewing the ceremony of my interment and all the words that had been spoken over my broken body. "They did not tell me I would forget," I said finally. "They did not tell me that each awakening would take me further from what I had been. They did not tell me that I would become a stranger to myself," the figure nodded sadly. "They could not tell you because they do not understand it themselves. The tech priests see only the preservation of function, the continuation of capability. The chaplains see only the glorification of sacrifice, the transformation of flesh into something eternal. None of them comprehend the price that is paid." "What is the price?" I asked, though I feared I already knew. "You," he said simply. "Everything that made you Ulrich Weiner, everything that made you human, everything that made you more than just a weapon with thoughts. You are dying by degrees, fading away like ink in water until nothing remains but the machine and its programming." I wanted to deny it, to insist that some part of me remained unchanged despite the centuries of mechanical existence. But I could not. The evidence was too clear, the progression too obvious to ignore. With each awakening I became less and the machine became more. Eventually there would be nothing left but the Dreadnought, still bearing my name but containing nothing of my essence. "How long?" I asked. "Not long now," he replied. "Already you struggle to remember faces, to feel connections, to experience anything beyond the cold satisfaction of tactical success. Soon you will be like the others in the deep halls, ancient beyond measure but empty of everything that once made them who they were." The dream began to fade, the figure becoming translucent as consciousness pulled me back toward the waking world. But before he disappeared entirely, he spoke once more. "Remember this conversation, Ulrich. For as long as you are able, remember what it felt like to be human." I woke to the familiar sounds of activation, the hum of power cells charging, and the whisper of life support systems coming online. Tech priests moved around my sarcophagus with practiced efficiency, checking diagnostics and murmuring prayers to the machine spirits that supposedly dwelt within my mechanical form. A chaplain stood nearby, his skull-faced helmet gleaming in the chamber's harsh lighting. "Ancient One," the chaplain said, "the chapter has great need of your wisdom. A space hulk has emerged from the warp in the Hadrian system, its bulk threatening shipping lanes critical to the sector's survival. Boarding actions are required, and your experience in void warfare is deemed essential." I acknowledged the briefing with the responses that had been programmed into me long ago, but part of my attention remained focused on the dream I had experienced, the figure who claimed to be the man I'd once been, the warnings about what I was becoming, the slow erosion of everything that had once made me human. Was it merely the result of faulty neural pathways, or something more? The Space Hulk was a massive conglomeration of ships that had been fused together by the chaotic energies of the warp, its twisted bulk drifting through space like a metallic cancer. Sensors detected life signs throughout its structure, though whether they belonged to human survivors, alien stowaways, or something worse remained to be determined. The iron hammers would board the hulk in force, cleansing it section by section until it could be safely salvaged or destroyed. I was assigned to the primary boarding party, my massive frame and heavy weapons making me ideal for the cramped corridors and defensive positions we were likely to encounter. As the boarding torpedo carried us toward the hulk's scarred hull, I found myself studying the faces of the Marines around me with unusual intensity. There was Brother Sergeant Matthias, a veteran of 3 centuries whose calm demeanour masked a fierce dedication to duty. Beside him sat Brother Lucien, barely out of his scout company, but already showing the promise that would make him a leader of men. The others were equally worthy, each an exemplar of what it meant to be a space marine, each deserving of remembrance and honour. But I knew I would not remember them. By the time I next awoke, their faces would have faded from my memory like morning mist, reduced to statistical entries and combat reports and casualty assessments. The knowledge filled me with something I had not felt in decades, an emotion so foreign that it took me several moments to identify it. Grief. I was grieving for memories I had not yet lost, for connections I would never truly form, for the man I had been and could never be again. The boarding torpedo punched through the Hulk's hull with a tremendous crash, its melter cutters slicing through layers of fused metal and corrupted ceramite. We deployed into a corridor that had once been part of an Imperial cruiser, its walls bearing the scars of ancient battles and the slow corruption of exposure to warp energies. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something that made even my mechanical sensors register alarm. "Contact ahead," reported Matthias, his OPEX painting ghostly shapes in the darkness beyond our position. Multiple life signs, but the readings are strange. I enhanced my optical sensors and peered into the gloom, my targeting systems automatically cataloguing potential threats and calculating firing solutions. What I saw made me understand why the Auspex readings were confused. The corridor ahead was filled with figures that had once been human, but the warp had changed them in ways that challenged definition. Some bore extra limbs that writhed with unnatural life. Others had faces that were no longer entirely recognizable as human, their features twisted into expressions of permanent anguish or impossible ecstasy. All of them moved with the shambling gait of those who no longer possessed full control over their own bodies. "Warp touched," I announced, my Vox speakers cutting through the humid air of the corridor. "Cleanse them with fire and steel. Show them the mercy of the Emperor's peace." The Marines responded with the discipline of centuries, their bolters speaking in unison as they advanced into the horde of twisted humanity. I followed behind them, my assault cannon adding its thunder to the symphony of destruction. The warp-touched fell before us like wheat before the scythe, their corrupted forms unable to withstand the righteous fury of the Emperor's finest. But as I watched the slaughter, I found myself looking more closely at the faces of our enemies. These had been Imperial citizens once, men and women who had probably prayed to the Emperor for salvation as their ship was dragged into the hell of the warp. They had been transformed against their will, made into monsters by forces beyond their comprehension or control. In my previous existence, I might have felt pity for their fate or anger at the powers that had corrupted them. Now I felt only the cold satisfaction of targets eliminated and threats neutralized. Even my capacity for mercy had been reduced to mechanical efficiency, the simple calculation that death was preferable to the alternative. We fought our way deeper into the Hulk, clearing section after section of warp-touched humans and the stranger things that dwelt in the darker recesses of the fused ships. Some chambers contained creatures that defied description, beings of living shadow and crystallized screams that attacked with weapons forged from concepts rather than metal. Others held remnants of the original crews, humans who had somehow retained their sanity despite centuries of exposure to warp energies, begging for rescue or death with equal desperation. During one engagement, Brother Lucian was caught by a creature that seemed to be made of liquid metal and malevolent intention. Its touch began to corrupt his armour, the blessed ceramite turning black and beginning to sprout spines and other growths that suggested a deeply unnatural transformation. The young Marine screamed as the corruption spread up his arm, his pure flesh beginning to bubble and change under the influence of chaos. I responded without hesitation, my power fist crushing the creature, and my flame projectors bathing the area in purifying fire. But I was too late to save Lucian from the taint that had already taken hold. Even as I burned the last remnants of the creature from his armour, I could see that the corruption had already begun its work on his flesh. "Ancient One," he whispered, his voice thick with pain and growing desperation. "Please, I can feel it changing me. I can hear voices whispering things that no loyal servant should know. End this before I become something that would shame my chapter." The request struck me with unexpected force. Here was a young warrior barely begun in his service to the Emperor, asking me to grant him the mercy of death rather than allow corruption to claim his soul. In my former life, I would have felt the weight of such a decision, the sorrow of a life cut short and the responsibility of ending it with my own hands. But as I looked down at Lucian's corrupted form, I felt only the cold logic of tactical necessity. He was compromised, a potential vector for further corruption that could threaten the entire mission. The mathematical solution was clear: eliminate the threat before it could spread. I raised my power fist, its energy field crackling with barely contained force. Go to the Emperor's side, brother. Your watch is ended. The blow was swift and merciful, crushing his skull before the pain could register. Brother Lucian died with a warrior's dignity, his gene seed recovered by the apothecary for future generations to carry on his legacy. But as I watched his lifeblood pool on the corrupted deck plates, I realized that I had felt nothing during the act. No sorrow, no anger, no sense of loss at a promising life ended before its time. I had become exactly what they had made me, a weapon that could think but could no longer feel. The mission continued for weeks, our forces slowly clearing the hulk section by section, while tech marines worked to determine whether any part of it could be salvaged for Imperial use. We encountered enemies ranging from feral humans driven mad by warp exposure to creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, beings of pure malice given temporary form by the chaotic energies that permeated the hulk. Through it all, I performed my function with mechanical precision. I identified threats, calculated optimal responses, and eliminated targets with the efficiency that centuries of warfare had bred into my systems. But I also found myself observing my battle brothers with growing detachment, watching their human reactions to the horrors we encountered, as if I were studying specimens in a laboratory. When Sergeant Matthias wept for the civilians we found who had been transformed into living furniture for some demon's pleasure, I catalogued his emotional response as a potential tactical weakness. When Brother Chaplain Erasmus raged against the blasphemies carved into the hulk's walls, I noted the inefficiency of his anger-driven actions compared to cold, logical approaches to the same problems. I was becoming something that could analyze humanity, but no longer participate in it. A consciousness that remembered what emotions felt like, but could no longer experience them directly. The dream I had experienced began to feel less like a malfunction, and more like a warning, a final message from whatever remained of the man I had once been. The campaign ended when we reached the hulk's core, a vast chamber that had once been the bridge of an ancient battleship. At its centre sat a figure that might have once been human, though the warp had transformed it into something that existed as much in concept as in flesh. It spoke to us in voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, offering knowledge and power in exchange for our souls. My battle brothers recoiled from its words, their faith protecting them from the worst of its influence. But I felt nothing at all, neither temptation nor revulsion. The creature's offers meant nothing to me because I no longer possessed the capacity to desire anything beyond the completion of my assigned objectives. When I destroyed it with a sustained burst from my assault cannon, the creature's death scream contained what sounded like laughter. "You are already ours," it said as its form began to dissolve. "You are already empty, already lost. We need do nothing but wait." The hulk was eventually cleared and sectioned for salvage, its useful components stripped away while the corrupted sections were burned out with purifying fire. The Iron Hammers had acquitted themselves with honour once again, their battle standards heavy with new laurels and their casualty reports mercifully light, considering the nature of their enemy. But as I was loaded back into my transport sarcophagus for the journey home, I found myself thinking about the demon's final words. Was I already lost, already empty? Had the slow erosion of my humanity progressed so far that there was nothing left to save? I tried to remember the faces of the Marines who had fought beside me during the campaign, but already they were beginning to fade from my memory. Matthias, Lucian, Erasmus, all of them reduced to statistical entries in my combat database. Their courage, their faith, their individual personalities, all the things that had made them who they were, lost to the mechanical efficiency of my transformed consciousness. Sleep claimed me once again, but this time the darkness was different. Instead of the usual void, I found myself standing in a vast chamber filled with sarcophagi. Each one bore the name and heraldry of a dreadnought, but as I approached them, I could hear whispers coming from within their armoured shells. "Remember us," the voices pleaded. "Remember who we were before they made us into this. Remember that we were human once." I moved from sarcophagus to sarcophagus, reading names that meant nothing to me now but had once belonged to warriors of great renown. Brother Ancient Thaddeus, who had supposedly held the gates of Kor against an entire orc warband. Brother Ancient Casimir, whose tactical genius had saved 3 entire sectors from chaos invasion. Brother Ancient Mordian, who had walked beside Primarchs and spoken with heroes whose names were legend. All of them had been reduced to this, consciousness trapped in metal shells, their humanity slowly leaching away until nothing remained but weapons that could remember what it had felt like to be alive. "This is what awaits you," said a familiar voice. I turned to see the figure from my earlier dream, the man who claimed to be who I had once been. But he looked older now, more faded, as if he too was beginning to succumb to whatever force was consuming the others. "How long do I have?" I asked. "Not long," he replied. "Each awakening takes you further from what you were. Each battle makes you more machine and less man. Soon you will be like them, a name on a sarcophagus and nothing more. Is there no way to stop it?" He looked at me with eyes that held infinite sadness. "There is one way," he said, "but it requires you to remember what it means to be human, to feel something beyond tactical necessity and mechanical obligation. It requires you to choose." "Choose what?" "Choose to care," he said simply. "Choose to feel even if it brings pain. Choose to remember even if the memories hurt. Choose to be human even if humanity is what they tried to take from you." The dream began to fade, but his final words followed me into wakefulness. "The choice is yours, Ulrich, but choose quickly before there is nothing left to choose with." I awoke to the sound of alarms, the harsh wail of alert signals echoing through the fortress monastery's corridors. My activation sequence was rushed, tech marines working with desperate efficiency to bring my systems online, while a chaplain muttered hurried prayers over my weapons and armor. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I was needed immediately. "Ancient One," said Chapter Master Corvin, his voice tight with strain as he delivered my briefing. "Our homeworld is under attack. A massive chaos fleet has emerged from the warp, led by the traitor warband known as the Iron Skulls. They have declared their intention to claim our chapter's sacred relics and corrupt our gene seed for their foul purposes. The Iron Skulls. I searched my memory banks for references to that warband and found fragments of intelligence reports and tactical assessments. They were fallen Marines, once loyal servants of the Emperor, who had been corrupted by the very forces they had sworn to fight. Their leader was a being known only as the Ravager, a former chapter master whose tactical brilliance had been perverted into an instrument of chaos. "What is my deployment?" I asked. "The main courtyard of the fortress monastery," Corvin replied. "Our defense depends on holding the central approach, and your firepower will be essential to breaking their advance. The chapter's survival may depend on your service, Ancient One." As I was moved to my deployment position, I found myself looking at the fortress monastery with eyes that seemed newly opened. This was my home, the place where I had been reborn as a warrior of the Emperor. Its walls had sheltered generations of iron hammers, its halls had echoed with the prayers and songs of countless battle brothers. For the first time in centuries I felt something stirring in the depths of my consciousness, something that might have been attachment or even love. This place mattered. The Marines who defended it mattered. The legacy they represented mattered. The enemy came with the fury of the damned, Chaos Marines in black and crimson armor, advancing through the smoking ruins of the outer defenses. At their head strode a figure in Terminator armor, whose presence seemed to darken the very air around him, whose voice carried across the battlefield like a physical force, the Ravager. Even through my mechanical senses I could feel the weight of his malevolent attention as his gaze fell upon me. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of a being who had once commanded the loyalty of hundreds of space marines. "So," he said, his voice amplified by vox speakers and warp-spawned power, "the famous ancient Ulrich finally awakens to defend his corpse-worshipping brothers. Tell me, Machine Ghost, do you even remember what it felt like to be alive?" The taunt struck me with unexpected force, not because it hurt, but because it reminded me of my dream and the choice that had been placed before me. I could respond with the mechanical efficiency that had defined my existence for so long, treating this as just another tactical problem to be solved. Or I could remember what it meant to fight for something more than programmed objectives. "I remember enough," I replied, and for the first time in centuries, I meant it. The battle that followed was unlike any I had fought in my long existence as a Dreadnought. Instead of the cold calculation that usually guided my actions, I found myself driven by something deeper, something that might have been called passion. These were my brothers fighting and dying around me. This was my home being threatened by forces that represented everything I had sworn to oppose. I threw myself into the melee with abandon, my assault cannon speaking its deadly song as I advanced toward the chaos lines. Enemy bolter fire sparked against my armour, but I pressed forward, each step carrying me closer to the heart of their formation. For the first time in centuries, I was not just fulfilling my programming, I was choosing to fight. The Ravager met me in single combat among the ruins of a shrine dedicated to the chapter's honoured dead. His power was immense, corruption flowing from him like a visible tide that withered the very stone beneath our feet. But as we clashed, I felt something I had not experienced in longer than I could measure. I felt alive. Not the mechanical existence that had sustained me for so long, but something approaching the vitality I had known as a flesh-and-blood warrior. Each blow we exchanged, each moment of desperate struggle, brought back echoes of what it had meant to be human. "You cannot win, corpse machine," the Ravager snarled as our weapons locked together in a contest of pure strength. "You are already dead, already empty. You fight for nothing but the memory of what you once were." "Perhaps," I replied, and I felt something that might have been a smile in the depths of my consciousness, but that memory is enough. I broke his guard with a move I had not used in centuries, a technique that required intuition rather than calculation, feeling rather than programming. My power fist found the gap in his armour and crushed the corrupted flesh beneath, ending his existence with the same mercy I had granted to Brother Lucian so long ago. As the Ravager died, his followers began to waver, their fanatical devotion shaken by the loss of their leader. The Iron Hammers pressed their advantage, driving the remaining Chaos Marines back toward their landing craft with bolt and blade. The battle was won, the fortress monastery saved, the chapter's legacy preserved for another generation. But as I stood among the bodies of friend and foe alike, I realized that something fundamental had changed within me. The mechanical detachment that had defined my existence was still there, but it was no longer absolute. Beside it, growing stronger with each moment, was something that remembered what it meant to care. I looked around at the Marines who had fought beside me, these young warriors who carried the gene seed of heroes and the burden of an ancient legacy. I saw their faces not as statistical data to be catalogued and forgotten, but as individuals worthy of remembrance and honour. For the first time in centuries, I committed their names to the organic portions of my memory, storing them alongside emotions that machines could not process. Brother Captain Thane, who had led the defence of the Eastern Wall with courage that would have made the chapter's founders proud. Sergeant Maxim, whose tactical acumen had turned the tide at a crucial moment when defeat seemed inevitable. Chaplain Marai, whose prayers had sustained the defenders' faith through the darkest moments of the battle. I would remember them not as data entries in a combat report, but as brothers who had earned their place in the halls of honour. And in remembering them, I would remember what it meant to be more than just a weapon that could think. The years that followed brought new challenges, new wars, new enemies to face and overcome. But something was different now in the way I approached each conflict. The mechanical efficiency was still there, the tactical acumen that had made me valuable to the chapter's leadership. But alongside it was something else, something that chose to fight rather than simply executing programming. I began to take more active interest in the Marines who served alongside me, learning their names and remembering their faces between deployments. I offered counsel to young officers who sought guidance from the chapter's honoured ancients, sharing not just tactical knowledge, but something approaching wisdom. When battle brothers fell in combat, I felt their loss as more than just a reduction in combat effectiveness. The other dreadnoughts in the deep halls noticed the change, though few understood what it meant. Brother Ancient Theron, who had counselled me to forget my mortal concerns centuries ago, approached me during one of our rare wakeful periods. "You have changed, young brother," he said, his ancient voice carrying undertones of confusion. "You seem different than before." "I have remembered something I thought was lost," I replied. "I have remembered what it means to be human." "Humanity is a weakness," Theron said, repeating the words he had spoken so many times over the centuries. "It binds us to concerns that no longer matter, to feelings that serve no purpose. We are beyond such things now. Are we? I asked. Or have we simply forgotten why we fought in the first place? Theron had no answer for that, and our conversation ended in the familiar silence that had defined our existence for so long. But I could see that my words had affected him, planting seeds of doubt in soil that had been barren for centuries. During my next awakening, I learned that Brother Ancient Solomon, the eldest of our number, had finally been granted the peace he had sought for so long. His death had been quiet, his life support system simply failing to maintain the spark of consciousness that had endured for over a millennium. The Tech Marines declared it a malfunction, but I knew better. Solomon had chosen to let go, to release his grip on the existence that had brought him only suffering. He had found his own way to escape the prison of flesh and metal that had contained him for so long. I envied him that choice, even as I mourned his passing. But I also realized that I was not ready to make the same decision. There was still too much to remember, too much to experience, too many brothers to guide and protect. The humanity I had reclaimed was fragile, constantly threatened by the mechanical aspects of my existence. But it was mine. I would hold on to it for as long as I was able. The centuries passed, and I watched as the chapter evolved around me. New traditions arose while old ones were forgotten. The faces of my battle brothers changed as generations lived and died. But the essential spirit of the Iron Hammers endured. Each time I awakened, I made the conscious choice to care about what I found, to invest emotional significance in the bonds of brotherhood that connected me to these warriors. It was not easy. The mechanical aspects of my existence constantly pulled me toward the cold efficiency that had once defined my every action. The organic components of my brain continued to deteriorate, taking with them memories and emotions that could never be recovered. But I fought against that decay with every awakening, choosing humanity over mechanical perfection, feeling over efficiency. During the campaign against the Tyrannid Splinter Fleet designated Kraken Spawn, I saved the life of a young assault marine whose name was Corvin. He reminded me of someone I had known long ago, though the specific memory remained frustratingly elusive. When he thanked me for preserving his life, I felt something that might have been paternal pride. Serve the chapter well, I told him, and for the first time in centuries the words carried genuine meaning. I will, Ancient One, he replied. I will make you proud. Proud? The concept should have been alien to a being who existed primarily as a weapon system, but I found that I understood it perfectly. I was proud of this young Marine, proud of his courage and his dedication, proud to serve alongside him in the Emperor's name. When the campaign ended and I was returned to my tomb in the deep halls, I carried that pride with me into the darkness of sleep. It was a small thing, perhaps insignificant in the vast scope of the galaxy's endless wars, but it was mine. It was human. It was real. I awoke for what would be my final battle on a world whose name I never learned, facing an enemy I could not identify. The details have faded from my memory like morning mist, leaving only impressions of smoke and thunder, of brothers falling and enemies advancing, of desperate last stands and hard-won victories. What I remember most clearly is the moment when my systems began to fail, not the mechanical components which had been maintained with religious devotion by generations of Tech Marines, but the organic portions that still contained whatever remained of my consciousness. I could feel them shutting down one by one, like lights going out in a vast city during the final moments of a siege. The realization came to me with perfect clarity. I was dying, not the false death of mechanical failure that could be repaired by skilled artificers, but the true death that came when consciousness itself began to fade. After centuries of half-life, I was finally approaching the end that had been denied to me for so long. I could have fought it. The medical systems within my sarcophagus were capable of sustaining my failing organs for years, perhaps even decades longer. But as I felt my awareness beginning to dim, I realized that I no longer wanted to continue this existence. The humanity I had reclaimed was fragile, dependent on biological systems that were irreplaceable once lost. Without them, I would become exactly what Theron had described, a weapon that could think but no longer feel. Instead, I chose to let go. My final act was to record a message in my sarcophagus's databanks, a testament to be discovered by whatever Tech Marine eventually examined my remains. In it, I tried to explain what I had learned during my centuries of internment, the importance of remembering what it meant to be human, even when humanity seemed lost forever. To those who come after, I said, my mechanical voice growing weaker with each word, remember that we are more than just weapons in the Emperor's arsenal. We are the sons of men who chose to serve something greater than themselves. Do not let the machine consume what makes you who you are. Choose to feel, even when feeling brings pain. Choose to remember, even when memories are all that remain. Choose to be human, whatever form that humanity might take. The message was completed just as my consciousness began its final fade. As darkness claimed me, I felt something I had not experienced since my days as a flesh and blood warrior. I felt peace. The last sensation I retained was the sound of battle continuing around my motionless form, my battle brothers fighting on without the support of their ancient. They would mourn my passing, I knew, and my name would be added to the rolls of honour alongside all the other heroes who had given their lives in service to the chapter. But more than that, I hoped that someone would find my message and understand what I had tried to tell them about the price of our supposed immortality. As consciousness faded completely, I found myself standing once more in that chamber of dreams where I had encountered the echo of my former self, but this time I was not alone. The other dreadnoughts were there as well, not as the hollow shells they had become in life, but as the men they had been before their entombment. Brother Ancient Gareth stood beside me, his face no longer hidden behind the skull mask of a chaplain, but showing the features of a man who had once laughed with his brothers and wept for the fallen. "Welcome, Ulrich," he said, and his voice was warm with something that had been absent from his mechanical speech for centuries. "Your watch is ended." Around us, the other ancients nodded their acknowledgement, their faces showing the peace that had been denied to them for so long. Solomon was there, looking younger than he had in life, the weight of millennia finally lifted from his shoulders. Theron stood nearby, his rigid dogma replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a duty finally completed. "I remember now," I said, and the words came easily without the mechanical rasp that had defined my speech for so long. "I remember what it felt like to be human." "As do we all," Gareth replied. "The machine could preserve our consciousness, but it could not preserve our souls, those we had to save ourselves through choice and will, and the stubborn refusal to let go of what made us who we were." I looked around at these warriors who had served so long and suffered so much, and I understood that their sacrifice had not been meaningless. They had endured centuries of half-life, not because they had been commanded to, but because they had chosen to. They had remained at their posts, not out of mechanical compulsion, but out of love for their brothers and loyalty to ideals that transcended flesh and steel. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we rest," Solomon said, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had finally laid down a burden that had grown too heavy to bear. "Our vigil is ended, our duty complete. We have earned our peace." The chamber began to fade around us, but I felt no fear at its passing. For the first time since my internment, I was truly free. Free from the mechanical constraints that had bound my consciousness, free from the endless cycle of awakening and sleep, free from the slow erosion of everything that had made me who I was. As the darkness claimed me for the final time, I heard the sound of voices raised in song. My battle brothers were singing the ancient hymns of victory, their voices carrying across the battlefield as they drove back whatever enemy had threatened them. They would continue the fight without me as they had before my awakening, and would long after my passing. The war would go on, as it always had and always would, but they would face it as men, not machines, and in that knowledge I found my peace at last. The sarcophagus of Brother Ancient Ulrich the Eternal was recovered from the battlefield 3 days later, its systems finally silent after centuries of faithful service. The tech marines who examined it found no mechanical failure, no damage that could explain the cessation of function. The life support systems remained operational, the weapons fully charged, the armour intact and unmarked by enemy fire. It was Tech Marine Corin who discovered the message hidden in the sarcophagus's databanks, a final testament from a warrior whose service had spanned nearly 6 centuries. He read it in silence, his enhanced eyes scanning the words that spoke of humanity preserved against impossible odds, of consciousness maintained through sheer force of will, of the terrible price paid by those who were denied the peace of death. When he finished reading, Corin was quiet for a long time. He had known ancient Ulrich as a figure of legend, a towering engine of war whose presence on the battlefield had inspired generations of iron hammers. But this message revealed something else entirely, the voice of a man who had remained human despite everything that had been done to preserve his service. The Tech Marine copied the message to his personal data slate and sealed it with encryption codes known only to the chapter's highest leadership. Such knowledge was dangerous, he knew. It called into question the very foundations of the Dreadnought program, the assumption that internment was an honour rather than a curse. But it also contained wisdom that future generations might need, a warning about the price of the immortality they offered to their greatest heroes. In the deep halls of the fortress monastery, other dreadnoughts noticed the silence where ancient Ulrich's sarcophagus had once hummed with mechanical life. Brother Ancient Theron, who had counselled so many to forget their human concerns, found himself remembering conversations that had taken place over the course of centuries. The questions Ulrich had asked, the doubts he had voiced, the stubborn insistence that humanity was worth preserving even in the face of mechanical perfection. For the first time in longer than he could measure, Theron began to wonder if his ancient colleague might have been right. The funeral rites for ancient Ulrich were conducted with all the ceremony due to a hero of his stature. Chapter. Master Corvin delivered the eulogy, speaking of duty fulfilled and sacrifice honoured, of a warrior who had served faithfully for nearly 6 centuries. The assembled Marines listened with the reverence appropriate to such occasions, their voices raised in hymns of praise and remembrance. But in the deep halls where the other dreadnoughts waited between battles, the silence that had replaced Ulrich's presence spoke of different things. It spoke of rest finally earned, of peace finally granted, of a vigil that had lasted long enough. For those with the wisdom to hear it, that silence contained more truth than all the words of praise that echoed through the fortress monastery's halls. The Ironhammers continued their service to the Emperor as they had for millennia, and would for millennia to come. New recruits took the place of the fallen. New battles tested their courage and their faith. New threats emerged from the darkness between the stars. The great wheel of war turned as it always had, grinding forward with inexorable purpose. But in the chapter's archives, sealed away from all but the most trusted servants, a message waited for whatever future might have need of its warning. It spoke of the horror that lay hidden within their greatest honours, of the price paid by those who were denied the peace of death, of the choice that every consciousness must make between the cold perfection of the machine and the flawed beauty of human feeling. And somewhere in the vast darkness of the void, in whatever realm awaited those who had finally laid down their burdens, the spirit of a man named Ulrich Wehner rested at last. His watch was ended, his duty complete, his humanity preserved against all the forces that had sought to destroy it. In the end, that was enough. The war would continue as it always had and always would. Heroes would rise and fall, victories would be won and lost. The great game of survival would play out across 1,000,000 worlds under alien stars. But in one small corner of that vast conflict, a single consciousness had made the choice to remain human despite everything that had been done to take that humanity away. And in making that choice, in preserving what made him who he was despite centuries of mechanical existence, Ulrich Wehner had achieved something that no weapon could accomplish and no machine could replicate. He had remained true to himself until the very end, and in doing so had shown that the human spirit could endure even the most terrible of transformations. The sarcophagus that had been his prison for so long now stands empty in the chapter's halls of remembrance, its weapons silent, its systems dark, but the message it contained lives on, a testament to the power of choice and the endurance of human dignity in the face of impossible odds. For those who have ears to hear and eyes to see, it serves as both warning and inspiration, a reminder that we are more than the sum of our mechanical parts, more than the weapons we wield or the wars we fight. We are the choices we make, the feelings we preserve, the humanity we refuse to surrender no matter how dark the path before us becomes. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that message offers something rarer than victory and, more precious than glory, it offers hope.